Hello, I'm delighted to be here this evening talking about the queer history of the Bloomsbury Group. I'm going to start by focusing on the younger associates of the Bloomsbury Group in the 1920s, looking at what it meant to be young and queer 100 years ago, and how their open way of living and loving is still relevant to the present day. So in the years before the First World War, a collection of writers and artists began to make a name for themselves in England and America, celebrated for their irreverent spirit and provocative works of literature and art, including Nino Strachey, Virginia Woolf, Vanessa Bell, and Duncan Grant. They called themselves the Bloomsbury Group, and by the 1920s, they were at the height of their influence. Then a new generation stepped forward, creative young people who tantalized their elders with their captivating looks and bold ideas. Some were the children of Bloomsbury families, others were lovers who became friends. Most remarkably for the period, they were a group of queer young people who found the freedom to express their sexuality amidst a group of supportive adults. To a 21st century world still riven by homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, they provide a powerful historical example of the benefits of acceptance. Bloomsbury had always celebrated sexual equality and freedom in private, feeling that every person had the right to live and love in the way they chose. But as transgressive self-expression became more public, this younger generation gave old Bloomsbury a new voice. Together, they pioneered an inclusive way of living not seen for another century, a brief flowering of intergenerational acceptance, pushing at gender boundaries, flouting conventions, embracing sexual freedom. So, first of all, talking about old Bloomsbury. So the Bloomsbury Group had gained a controversial reputation before the First World War. By the 20s, they reached a new level of commercial success. Bloomsbury's irreverent spirit struck a chord with this post-war generation, reaching an audience eager to challenge traditional conventions. Young people who met them in person were struck by their frank approach to life and love. It was rare to find an older group so open to new ideas, so accepting of different sexualities. Meeting your heroes was easier when most of them lived next door to each other. Vogue's October 1925 edition provided a helpful guide to the Bloomsbury area of London. The Strachey family, Vanessa Bell, Clive Bell, Duncan Grant, and Maynard Keynes were all in Gordon Square, and Virginia and Leonard Woolf were just round the corner in Tavistock Square, living above their Hogarth press. Now, it's easy to imagine the Bloomsbury Group running on a smooth path towards success in continuous occupation of their favoured territory in London. But their habitat was in fact the result of determined action. Dispersed during the First World War, the friends came back together in the 20s like homing pigeons, reassembling in the streets around 46 Gordon Square, the home to which Vanessa and Virginia Stephen had escaped after the death of their father in 1904, seeking a life free from adult interference. It was here that the Stephen sisters had first got to know the Cambridge friends of their brothers, Toby and Adrian, finding new ways to connect. A commitment to honest communication between the sexes, to freedom in creativity, to openness in all sexual matters. A family of choice, they created ties of love that lasted a lifetime, embracing queerness, acknowledging difference, defying traditional moral codes. With Lytton Strachey as their agent provocateur, the friends challenged each other to break new ground. Economist Maynard Keynes stood alone amidst a group dominated by artists and writers. Painter Vanessa Stephen became Vanessa Bell when she married the art critic Clive Bell. Writer Virginia Stephen became Virginia Woolf when she married aspiring author Leonard Woolf. Of the writers, only E.M. Forster reached a major audience before the First World War. In the early days, it was the painters who gathered public attention. Curator and critic Roger Fry inspired Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell with his passion for the French post-impressionists. Seen as part of a pioneering group of British modernists, their reputations were amplified through association with the Omega Workshops, an artists' collective that helped to develop public perception of Bloomsbury as a brand. Critical support was just gathering momentum when war broke out in 1914, and the war years formed a temporary break in the group's activities. But sales of works by Bloomsbury writers and artists took off again after 1918, building a definitive reputation on both sides of the Atlantic. By this stage, most of the original members were nearing their 40s, their ideas honed by years of close-knit conversation. Lytton Strachey set the ball rolling with eminent Victorians in 1918. Maynard Keynes challenged conventional economic thinking with the economic consequences of the peace in 1919. Duncan Grant held his first solo exhibition in 1920, impressing reviewers with his defiantly modern style. Strachey followed up with Queen Victoria in 1921, breaking British publishing records by selling 4,000 copies in 24 hours, something I'd love to do. Virginia Woolf couldn't compete at this stage with Lytton's sales figures, but she took comfort in the response of literary critics, signing up with the same US publisher, Harcourt Brace, for her American editions. Virginia resented the way that journalists began to lump together pre-war founding members of Bloomsbury with the younger circle of admirers who gathered in the 20s. But other members of the group were more phlegmatic, well aware of the publicity value of linking their names with fashionable, bright young things. So young Bloomsbury seems the most helpful shorthand to describe these younger admirers who gathered near Gordon Square, renting rooms in Gordon Place, Taverton Street, Brunswick Square, and Heathcote Street. All you can walk around and map exactly where they were living today. And a lucky few actually found lodgings in Gordon Square itself, leasing whole floors of these tall Bloomsbury houses from Vanessa Bell or from Lytton's half-brother James and his wife Alex Strachey. Many were fresh from university, finding useful starter roles as models or assistants. They posed for Grant and Bell's paintings, organised exhibitions, set type for the Hogarth Press, and sifted Lytton Strachey's erotic correspondence. Others were already launched on their own successful careers, bringing reflected glory on their idols. Talented and productive, they led interesting professional lives and complicated emotional ones. Individually intriguing, their collective value has been consistently underplayed, their achievements obscured in later accounts. Young men dismissed as frivolous for embracing their femininity. Young women judged by their relationships rather than their careers. Connections with fashion, show business, or the popular press portrayed as culturally inferior to more intellectual pursuits. Most were graduates from Oxford, Cambridge, or the Slade School of Art, young people with artistic or literary ambitions seeking their way in the world. Nearly all were looking for ways to explore different sexual identities post-university, and Bloomsbury's approach was unusually appealing. His 20s London was a place of confusing extremes. On one side stood this new syncopated world of the bright young things with treasure hunts, fancy dress parties, jazz music, and cocktails. On the other stood the old establishment, stern figures of conservative reaction, represented most fearsomely by William Joynson Hicks, who was the repressive Home Secretary from 1924 to 29, who cracked down on nightclubs and indecent literature. At the beginning of the decade, Bloomsbury stood somewhere in between, offering safe spaces for experimentation and conversations of reassuring emotional honesty with men and women who had earned a reputation for candour. Gradually, the closed circle expanded to bring a wider range of new recruits, a more playful understanding of intellectually appropriate activity. And when I was researching this period, I was continually struck by the cultural resonances with the present day, this inclusive approach to sexuality, joyous exploration of different gender identities. And with this in mind, I want to consider this wonderful image taken by Cecil Beaton, because for me it symbolises more than anything this crossover between Bloomsbury and the bright young things. The photograph was taken on the morning of the 17th of October 1927 at Wilsford, the home of the artist Stephen Tennant, who you can see standing on the left. Later that day, the poet Siegfried Sassoon took Tennant over to tea with Lytton Strachey, and Strachey spread the story all round Bloomsbury, and Lytton sent a wry account to his lover Roger Senhouse in London. And he said of this group, he said, "The night before, they had all dressed up as nuns. That morning, they had all dressed up as shepherds and shepherdesses. In the evening, they were going to dress up as God knows what. But they begged and implored me to return with them and share their raptures." So this, inspired by the romantic pastoral paintings of the 18th century French painter Nicolas Lancret, Tennant had supplied his guests with 7 identical shepherds' outfits to wear in a tableau. Printed floral jerkins and with white ruffled collars on top, and they've all got knee breeches and stockings below. And there are a whole series of photographs, and Baton and Tennant led the group like Pied Pipers across the lawn at Wilsford, and they posed with these baskets of flowers and willow wands and straw hats. And although Lytton was correct to mention shepherds and shepherdesses, as both men and women were involved, the costumes are actually unisex. And if anything, the male members of the party look more decorative, as they seem to have whitened faces and rouged cheeks. And so these crop-headed young people skipped interchangeably across the grass, and they collapse and abandon beneath trees, and they line up on a rustic bridge, their ruffles and ribbons silhouetted against the sky. Lytton Strachey's Wiltshire home, Ham Spray, was only about a 40-minute drive from Wilsford, and Tennant would have found the atmosphere that day very welcoming. By October 1927, Lytton was deeply involved with a former Oxford student, Roger Senhouse, who made him so happy that Lytton said he wanted to do cartwheels over the downs. Somewhat unlikely, I think, but he felt like that. And he loved to deck Roger with garlands of flowers, and there's some wonderful photographs showing with Roger surrounded by lilies. And he devised plays and performances where genders were disguised. And in 1927, Lytton was writing Elizabeth and Essex, and echoes of his relationship with Roger appear in the description of his relationship between the aging queen and her much younger favourite. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that Ham Spray was all about Lytton and Roger. Lytton lived in a creatively productive polyamorous throuple with Dora Carrington and her husband Ralph Partridge. Carrington was a painter and decorative artist, and Partridge worked as Lytton's secretary and literary assistant. Their relationship was consensually non-monogamous, and Lytton welcomed Ralph and Carrington's lovers in the same way as they welcomed his. And Ham Spray became a creative crucible, with Lytton and Carrington nurturing the output of those they loved. Stephen Tomlin became Lytton's sculptor in ordinary at Ham Spray, fulfilling multiple commissions, notably a nymph of the ilex modelled on Lytton's niece, Julia, the writer Julia Strachey. And when Julia and Tomlin fell in love, Lytton and Carrington encouraged their work, supported the couple financially, and gave them refuge at Ham Spray whenever challenges arose. So, how did old Bloomsbury meet all these young people? By happy accident, Oxford University was only a short drive away from Garsington Manor, home of the pacifists Philip and Ottoline Murrell. A haven for Bloomsbury conscientious objectors before the war, it remained a welcome weekend retreat thereafter. And Ottoline's eccentricities were ruthlessly mocked by Lytton and Virginia, but the charm of her golden stone house with its shaded terraces was hard to resist. And I always think it's quite naughty of Bloomsbury Group members. They tended to be rude about those they stayed with, however often they went back. And in the 1920s, Garsington gained a new attraction. Delicate Oxford undergraduates, said by Virginia Woolf to grow like asparagus shoots on the lawn, because they were all so delicate and attenuated. So they were invited by Ottoline to amuse her teenage daughter. They were of much more interest to Lytton Strachey and Duncan Grant, who followed them attentively round the garden. And one young man who caught everyone's attention was Philip Ritchie, a handsome, broad-shouldered figure. He had thick auburn hair, green eyes, and a tendency to burst into song. Escaping the restrictions of his background through drink and gambling, Ritchie experienced a sense of release when introduced to Lytton's Bloomsbury friends, Carrington remembered him talking frenziedly about male love at Ham Spray, and Virginia Woolf used to use him as bait to tempt Lytton to her parties. And when Ritchie died suddenly of tonsillitis in 1927, Woolf experienced a twinge of regret. She wished she'd paid more attention to him during his life, been kinder to him. And suddenly conscious of her own mortality, Woolf wrote in her diary that she wanted to write a history of all her friends during their lifetimes. And she created a hero who evaded death, remaining forever young, changing their gender as the centuries progress. This was the book which became Orlando. Vita Sackville-West's role in the genesis of Orlando has been widely acknowledged. But the role of her first cousin, Eddy Sackville-West, and his circle of genderqueer Oxford friends tends to be downplayed. These were the graceful young men Virginia encountered at Garsington, surprising her with their tendency to wear lipstick and powder. Small and delicate, with large violet eyes, Eddy Sackville-West had his own distinctive charm. Virginia Woolf pretended to be irritated by Eddy's effeminacy, his frivolous interest in makeup and jewellery, but she never turned him away. She'd listened to agonized accounts of his broken relationships, had spirited debates with him regarding sexuality, and even said she would read his diary if it would help him to unravel his emotional complexities. He used to bring his diary round to her house and they'd read it together. After Oxford, Eddy's life became a crisscross of Bloomsbury connections. He moved into a London flat with Lytton's cousin John Strachey, and enjoyed brief but passionate love affairs with Stephen Tomlin and Duncan Grant. And his first two novels were snapped up by Heinemann and appeared in quick succession in 1925 and 26, which is pretty good when that's your first year after university, I think, one year after the other. And the proud young author was photographed for Vogue by Cecil Beaton, lying under a leopard skin with Stephen Tennant. It's a wonderful photograph. They're all lying with their heads tipped back. Now, Stephen Tennant didn't go to Oxford. He trained at the Slade School of Fine Art, but he fitted very neatly with Eddy's circle of painted Oxford boys. His clothing designs explored the boundaries between masculinity and femininity. Sometimes they veered into full drag, as when he appeared as Queen Marie of Romania for the impersonation party of July 27. And more often they were blended in approach with an element of parodic humour, as with his pink satin outfit for the Great Lovers of the Ages pageant, where, according to the press, he had difficulty with the slipper of his Cinderella. Now, Tennant produced beautiful line drawings in the style of Aubrey Beardsley, and his proud mother mounted his first solo exhibition at the age of 15. Tennant's designs, by 27, he was swamped with illustrative work for books and magazines, and his designs were sensuous and atmospheric, with a hint of the Russian artist Leon Bakst, as well as Aubrey Beardsley. And his exploration of bodily adornment and his love of performance anticipate the self-expressive confidence of modern drag culture, and his friends remembered his public appearances fondly. So we've talked about Oxford and the Slade. I'm now going to move on to talk about Cambridge, which was an equally productive source of stimulating youth. So Maynard Keynes left the Treasury to return to King's College as an economics lecturer in 1919, and one of his first actions was to help revive the Apostles, the secret discussion society where many of the original Bloomsbury group had met in the early 1900s. Old members were allowed to return for the Saturday night meetings, and Lytton Strachey and E.M. Forster spent many pleasurable weekends in Cambridge surveying each new set of initiates. And I love the idea of them coming back every weekend to meet these new generations of students. So one of them was a young man called Walter Sprott, who was rebranded as Sebastian when he joined the Apostles. And he enjoyed a non-exclusive relationship with Maynard Keynes from 1920 to 1925. He was the son of a provincial solicitor, and he was less financially comfortable than some of his Oxford contemporaries. He was elegantly attenuated, and he had sharp cheekbones and a shock of dark hair. And he was studying moral sciences with the hope of becoming an academic. Friendly and self-effacing, he was quickly absorbed into many Bloomsbury households. Virginia Woolf worried about his skinny frame, his lack of resources, and made sure he was invited to Garsington. And there's a lovely picture of Sebastian, as he was by that point, on his bicycle, because he was bicycling from Oxford Station out to Garsington. Vanessa Bell employed him one summer as a tutor for her children, and he also served as a model for her and Duncan Grant. Now, Sebastian took a double first and went on to become a professor of psychology at the University of Nottingham. And here he began a long-term relationship with a local man called Charles Lovett. And it was through Sebastian and his writer friend, Joe Ackerley, that E.M. Forster began to connect more regularly with young gay men from working-class backgrounds. And Forster found these experiences life-changing, triggering revisions to his novel, Morris, and the creation of other works celebrating love between men of different social classes. Although none of this material could be published during Forster's lifetime, due to the looming threat of prosecution, the posthumous impact was considerable. Dismissed by Lytton as colourless, another Cambridge student, Angus Davidson, made a deeper impression on the artist Duncan Grant, who found him inspiring as a lover and a model, returning to the same subject again and again. And Angus would sit patiently for portraits in oils and for intimate drawings of his naked form. And when he moved into rooms in Heathcote Street, near Gordon Square, Duncan covered the walls and his furniture with romantic decoration, serenading lovers on the cupboards, arum lilies over the fireplace, panels of swirling colour in every alcove. And again, this is a lovely gesture. Duncan said that when he went to the home of anybody who had nothing, he longed to fill the walls with decoration. And Angus's rooms ended up being illustrated in Vogue and in new interior decoration as examples of Duncan's work. And astute observers would have noticed his figure appearing both naked and clothed in Duncan's solo exhibition at the Independent Gallery in 1923. And in 1924, the Woolfs took him on as their assistant at the Hogarth Press, thankful to have found someone so quiet and industrious to rely on. And I think it's lovely the way you see these young people being employed in all sorts of different ways across the Bloomsbury group. Virginia Woolf and Lytton Strachey would also go to watch student performances from another Cambridge student, the beautiful Dady Rylands. Duncan Grant designed costumes and stage sets. Cecil Beaton photographed him dressed as the Duchess of Malfi. And Woolf offered Dady a job at the Hogarth Press and published his first volume of poetry, which was called Russet and Taffeta. But he decided to return to Cambridge to lecture in English. And Dady and his artist friend Douglas Davidson rented rooms from Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant at number 37 Gordon Square. And Dady and Douglas threw parties at number 37, which spread throughout the house. And what was interesting about them is that they crossed the world of stage and cinema, introducing Bloomsbury to film stars such as Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks. Evenings out with Dady could be a roller coaster ride, and I find it quite exhausting hearing about them. But on one night, apparently, he and Lytton started their fun at the Café Royal, went on to Churro's nightclub, then to various apartments via taxi, drinking champagne on the way. And on another night, they had dinner at the Ivy. Then they went off to the BBC to listen to Dady give a broadcast. And they finished the evening in a pub so that Dady could pick up a soldier. And Lytton leaves long accounts of each of these evenings, which I think are quite fun. Then finally, talking about young relations. So sometimes these connections were sort of closer to home, because there were a few children of Bloomsbury families who reached adulthood in the early 20s. And of these, the Stracheys were most numerous. Julia Strachey, who was the eldest child of Lytton's brother Oliver, would have stood out in any crowd. Virginia Woolf described her as a gifted wastrel, one of those beautiful young people who seem to be able to turn their hand to everything and actually end up settling at nothing. Julia could write and act, and she drew with unusual sensitivity, and apparently she played jazz piano like a demon. Her father hoped she'd make her living as a commercial artist and sent her to study at the Slade. But what Julia really wanted to do was write. And so, encouraged by Lytton and by Carrington, Julia filled notebook after notebook with Proustian descriptions of the world around her. And Virginia Woolf kept a beady eye on Julia's work and prized her first finished novel out of her hands, complaining that she was a typical Strachey and slippery as an eel. And then Julia's cheerful weather for the wedding was duly published by the Hogarth Press with a cover drawing of Julia by Duncan Grant. And it was very successful and reviewed both in England and America as an interesting, perceptive book. So Uncle Lytton and Tante Carrington, as she called herself, fostered a consensually non-monogamous union with Julia and the bisexual sculptor Stephen Tomlin. And so to say a bit about Tommy, who dropped out of Oxford to study with the established sculptor Frank Dobson. And he had a studio in Fulham and a cohort of willing sitters, and he seemed destined for a shining future. The couple married in 1927 and moved to Swallowcliffe in Wiltshire, but Tommy lived a life of sensory extremes. When happy, his wild excitement was infectious, his energy mesmeric. When sad, he'd be plunged into almost fathomless despair. He might be present for weeks, then withdraw in silence to his studio, refusing all contact. Julia accepted Tommy's bisexuality, well aware of his ongoing relationships with many Bloomsbury figures, young and old, and she even welcomed one of his male lovers into their home. What she found harder to cope with were his periods of severe depression and frenzied self-reproach. She was perfectly happy for them to live this way, but she didn't want him to be complaining about it. But however erratic his moods, the young sculptor went on to create the definitive images of Duncan Grant, Lytton Strachey, and Virginia Woolf. And today, many of his pieces are in public collections, displayed at Charleston, Monk's House, Tate, and the National Portrait Gallery. And his bust of Woolf stares angrily out from a pedestal in Tavistock Square. Woolf absolutely hated being pinned down for sittings. And I think she actually described Tommy to Lytton as the man I hate most in the world. And her furious discontent is etched into the clay, creating an image of haunting potency, and it remains her best-known representation. And if any of you don't know it, I'd encourage you to go and look at Tavistock Square at the bust that was funded by the Virginia Woolf Society. Julia's cousin John Strachey seemed set to follow the typical family path. Having been embedded in the aesthetic crowd at Oxford, he became a regular at Garsington before setting up home in London with Eddy Sackville-West, we heard about earlier. And inspired by the same sense of Bloomsbury rebellion against conventional moral and social practices, John took his activism beyond that personal sphere and into the political arena. John joined the Labour Party, campaigning for his first parliamentary seat in 1924. He became a committed Marxist, editing the Socialist Review and standing on the side of the workers in the general strike of 1926. The Gordon Square Stracheys took this more personal approach to social change. Their dissent was embodied in individual action, and they never sought a fundamental change to the organisation of their country. John Strachey had grown up in a more revolutionary era, exposed to the call of Soviet propaganda, lured by the dream of a socialist utopia. John became a Labour MP in 1929, and his 1932 book, The Coming Struggle for Power, became one of the UK's most influential Marxist publications. So, if we think about John's radical political beliefs and Tommy's character-revealing sculpture, they represent these interesting touch points between the generations. Each group had something to learn from the other. Cross-dressing bright young people were as happy to be snapped by Cecil Beaton in broad daylight as they were after dark. And Bloomsbury figures began to embrace the new approach, appearing in popular magazines alongside writers and artists 20 years their junior. Over the next decade, the Oxford and Cambridge graduates transformed into journalists, novelists, poets, and party givers, inviting their seniors to join in the fun. After some agonized wrestling with intellectual snobbery, Virginia Woolf embraced the high fees offered for pieces in vogue. In an equally bold step, Grant and Woolf signed up as founder members of the Gargoyle Club in Soho, which became a centre for bohemian nightlife in the decades that follows, tempted by the ideas of a club free from rules where members were encouraged to express themselves freely. And I love the idea of Virginia Woolf at the Gargoyle, which is a very sort of countercultural place. She tended to go there at lunchtime rather than the evenings, I think is what she said. So the younger generation promoted and inspired their seniors, propelling them into new types of media and energizing their artistic and literary production. Bloomsbury figures learnt to broadcast on the radio, mix cocktails, dance the black bottom, and exploit the publicity value of gossip columns. This was the age of the elaborate fancy dress party, and Bloomsbury loved nothing more than gender-blurring costume. Lytton Strachey and Clive Bell would appear regularly on guest lists in the Evening Standard, donning elaborate outfits for events like the Nautical Party or the Circus Party. And Woolf accepted almost as many invitations, merrily denouncing her hosts and fellow guests afterwards. You wouldn't want to necessarily be recorded. Woolf. And she and Lytton adored gossip and sexual intrigue, lending a willing ear to troubled young lovers of varying orientations. Journalist Raymond Mortimer was one of many to find contact with Bloomsbury a transformative experience. As a smart young man about town, he was soon writing pieces for the New Statesman and Vogue. Slim, dark, and attractive, with a mop of curly hair, Raymond would never be Lytton's idea of a beauty, but he cut a dashing figure. Virginia was amused by his tiger-striped sweaters and his loud ties, she used to comment on regularly, and the curious shape of his inquisitive nose. Ever charming, he was invited everywhere, figuring as often in the social columns as he did in the review pages. For a few brief years, Raymond became what would be described today as a social influencer. Old Bloomsbury was pleased when he reviewed their work or attended their parties, and young Bloomsbury turned out in droves for his after-dinner gatherings. His flat in Gordon Place was helpfully located halfway between the Woolf's home in Tavistock Square and the growing cohort of Bloomsbury Group members in Gordon Square itself, and his top floor rooms became the setting for regular late-night parties. Some were mixed, including his Vogue editor Dorothy Todd and her partner Madge Garland, but the majority were for men only. Vogue articles tend to mention Raymond's bizarre newspaper wallpaper. He had topical figures all over the walls, but they tend not to dwell on his pair of backlit wig stands she had in the corner, and the cupboards beneath them were painted by the surrealist John Banting with naked men and the portraits of male friends. In the adjoining room, murals by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell show rich red curtains being drawn back to reveal a lush garden filled with fountains, flowers, and fruit. The stage was set for amorous interactions on the divan below, and all of those interiors were photographed and repeatedly used as promotion both for Raymond himself and for the artists in the group. Every now and then, Virginia Woolf would stray into one of Raymond's evenings, and the frankness of conversation pops up in her letters and diaries. Images are passed round, relationships discussed, clothing admired, and similar intimacies are shared in correspondence between young and old, male and female across the group. In letters to Lytton, Dady Rylands reveals his passion for fellow students, his success with soldiers and sailors. Dora Carrington sends love and lust to Lytton's niece Julia Strachey. Lytton teases Sebastian Sprott for gladdening the eye of male admirers with his taste for rings, décolleté shirts, and Venetian sombreros. I'm ashamed to say I don't know what a Venetian sombrero looks like, but it sounds fun. Eddy Sackville-West pours out his heart to Lytton's psychoanalyst sister-in-law, Alex Strachey, who returns the favour with tortured accounts of her rejection by her lover Nancy Morris. So sexual openness of this type between friends would be impressive in the 2020s, but in the 1920s it was remarkable. Homosexuality remained illegal, and hostile attitudes to lesbian love were whipped up when Radcliffe's Hall Well of Loneliness was condemned as an obscene publication in 1928. Bloomsbury provided a supportive environment for queer young people that they were unlikely to find elsewhere. For those who could afford it, mental health care tended to be a traumatic experience. Mainstream psychiatry still saw same-sex love as an illness requiring treatment. My heart bleeds for Eddy Sackville-West, who was subjected to an 8-week cure in Germany involving painful testicular injections. Stephen Tennant spent 12 months of virtual isolation in a psychiatric hospital. Freudian approaches were scarcely more sympathetic. The leading British psychoanalyst, Dr. Ernest Jones, diagnosed Stephen Tomlin's lover Henrietta Bingham as suffering from sexual inversion with neurotic symptoms and suggested strategies for displacement. Using Henrietta as a case study for the treatment of female homosexuality, Dr. Jones was actually sharing progress reports with Freud in Vienna and anonymised accounts with the British Psychoanalytical Society. And it's really interesting to read that, that analysis of what was happening at the time. Virginia Woolf took no prisoners with her language, but it was surely far better to feel able to have a robust debate with Virginia or Lytton on sexual terminology than to sit in fearful silence, ashamed of your unmentionable identity. Why does this matter to me? Queerness is no longer seen as a mental illness in Britain, but the mistreatment of queer young people persists. Bullying and discrimination lead to alarming rates of depression, self-harm, and feelings of suicide. Children and young adults still go to school and university feeling unsafe, their peers using labels they identify with as insults. Trans students are particularly at risk. With queer histories so often silenced and records destroyed through fear of discrimination or persecution, sharing stories of positive interaction between the generations takes on a new relevance. Older people play a vital role when they show their support, building confidence and nurturing future talent. And I found much to celebrate in the world of young Bloomsbury and in the queer history of my own family. Nino Strachey was one of the lucky guests at a party thrown by Virginia Woolf and her sister-in-law, Karen Stephen, in February 1925. Crowds of bright young people flooded through the doors. Nino Strachey hovered ecstatically amongst a group of Oxford undergraduates, invited specially to capture his attention. Vanessa Bell spent hours talking to the bisexual sculptor Stephen Tomlin, who was besieged by admirers from every side. And writing afterwards to her friend Jacques Ravera, Virginia conjured up a perfect vision of queer contentment. Young men in white tie and tails waltzing round the room in each other's arms, and young women flirting with each other in corners. So Bloomsbury group houses formed safe spaces for sexual expression, places where men who loved men would meet women who loved women with little threat of exposure or challenge. Gender nonconformity was to be expected, and age was never seen as a barrier. For a queer young person in the 20s, these homes provided welcome moments of life-affirming normality in a generally hostile adult world. Severe legal penalties threatened the unwary. Policemen prowled the streets around Piccadilly looking for signs of gross indecency, which at this point could mean wearing lipstick or powder compacts or wide-legged trousers were very suspicious. Tabloid journals like John Bull fulminated against the apparent rise in painted boys, deploring male use of perfume and cosmetics, encouraging arrests for anything that looked suspicious. But tall Bloomsbury houses had their drawing rooms on the first floor, and that meant that their transgressive parties were safely out of view from the pavements below. Men who danced with men became a clear target for police enforcement during this period. Plainclothes officers inveigled their way into clubs and dance halls, seething clothing and makeup as evidence and recording what they saw. If you were unlucky enough to have a hostile neighbour, raids could even be made on private homes. A dancer called Bobby Britt was subjected to the full force of the law when officers stormed into his basement flat at 25 Fitzroy Square, arresting everyone present. The police had been watching his home for several days, peering in through the bedroom roof lights, looking for signs of men entering together. A strange double standard seemed to apply. If found wandering near Piccadilly with a powder compact in his pocket, a young man could be charged for importuning for immoral purposes and sentenced to 3 months in prison. If invited to an expensive fancy dress ball, you could smother yourself in makeup and expect your face to appear in the press with little adverse comment, even if you were dressed as a foreign queen or a famous female film star. The context was critical regardless of social background. Men who enhanced their features on a daily basis were to be suspected of vice, their behaviour a signifier of sexual transgression. Guests transforming themselves to fit the theme of a party were apparently quite another matter. So the Bloomsbury Group reached a high point of fame in the 1920s. Success is always alluring, but this was not the only reason why a group of 40-somethings suddenly appealed so strongly to young men and women in their 20s. There was something else, something more subtle at play. The growing numbers of admirers who gathered like bees round a honeypot were not just seeking celebrity, they were seeking affection. As queer young people, they were looking for a place where they could be themselves amidst adults who would accept them for who they really were. Bloomsbury writers and artists seem to have defied conventional morality and lived to tell the tale. Faith, fidelity, heterosexuality and patriotism had all been rejected, but without noticeable penalty. Ahead of their time, they had established an open way of living that would not be embraced for another 100 years.